Good morning or afternoon, I think, depending on your time zone. We're here in New Mexico, so it's still, no, it's afternoon now. It is afternoon. And we are really thrilled to be here with you all today from New Mexico. We're going to share a little bit about an educator community of practice related to capstones and share our experiences together in that group and how it's influenced us as educators and the work that we do with young people in our state. And you can see on this introductory slide that there are several of us listed here. Our group is quite larger than this now. This was our group last year, and there are just a few of us here today with you. So we're going to just introduce ourselves very briefly, those of us who are here today. And while we do that, if you don't mind, in the chat, if you could please answer the check-in question to share your name, where you're from, your preferred pronouns, your role, where you are, and why you joined this session. And it's a norm of ours as a group to, and I'll put it in the chat for us. Oh, thank you. It's a norm for us as a group to start every meeting with a check-in, and they usually last about 30 to 45 minutes in an hour-and-a-half meeting. And so that just shows how much time we spend trying to connect with each other and to learn more about each other as a community. So we'll do the same today. If you don't mind sharing a little bit about yourself. And I'll introduce myself first, and then I'll pass it to Julie. We'll just go straight down the list here. So my name is Lisa Harmon-Martínez, and I work for Future Focused Education in New Mexico. It's a nonprofit. We do advocacy work to make educational change, systems change in New Mexico in a variety of areas. Assessment is my area of focus within the organization. So thank you all for joining us today. And Julie, I will pass it to you.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Julie Jaynes. I'm the Work-Based Learning Coordinator at ACE Leadership High School in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And I'll pass it to Kristen.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Kristen LaVolpa. I'm in the CNM, which is our community college here in New Mexico. I am in the teacher ed program, and I'm also a consultant with Future Focused Education. I'm going to go ahead and pass it to Laurie.
Good afternoon and welcome to our session. I'm Laurie Smith, Small West Bear of the Oceti Sakowin, or the 7 Council Fires of the Lakota Nation. I am formerly the capstone teacher at Zuni High School and now teaching in the middle school at Santa Fe Indian School. And I will pass the mic on to Minea.
I'm not sure she's joined just yet.
Thank you.
Oh, there you are, Minea. Oh, yay.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Minea Armijo Romero. I am part of CNM, Central New Mexico Community College. I'm full-time faculty in education programs. And I'm also a PhD candidate in the University of New Mexico at the Department of Language Literacy and Sociocultural Studies.
And Ronnie, I think last but not least.
Definitely not least. Thank you. Hello, everybody. Ronnie Reynolds here. This is my first year at Robert F. Kennedy Charter High School. I spent the previous 5 years at a different charter school building out their capstone. So this is my first year here building out Robert F. Kennedy's capstone. Here at RFK, it is a community action project. And I noticed in the chat, Allison Jackson, I'd be happy to meet with you and talk to you about building out capstones in the online setting. I did it throughout the entire pandemic. So welcome, everybody.
Okay, thank you all. I appreciate you all very much. So I think just to start, I'll share a little bit about the context in New Mexico, where we live, obviously, and work. And first, I'd just like to draw attention to the right side of the screen, where there's a map of New Mexico, where Indigenous people lived before their land was stolen by Spanish settlers. And that this really informs the work that we're doing now. The repercussions of that have been very consequential, of course, in our state. And just also to name that this process of sealing land also stole language and culture, as all of those things are very closely tied together in Indigenous communities in the state. And so it wasn't just that their land was stolen, their way of life, their connection to their history, all of that was lost as well. And so that's an important piece of context for us to understand the work that we're doing in New Mexico. And also, just to say that in our state constitution, Spanish language instruction is provided for. It's the only state in the country that calls for such instruction or protects a language other than English in the state constitution in this way in educational systems. And also to say that while the Spaniards were settling here and committing land theft from Indigenous people in this state, they were also establishing what is now our public school system. And so that's why Spanish language instruction is provided for or named in our state constitution. And then the same colonialists who came to settle and stole Indigenous land were then also colonized themselves to some extent and experienced language oppression and culture oppression as well as white settlers came into the area. Particularly the Protestants. And so this is an important piece of context for understanding the educational systems in New Mexico. Also near the top of the slide, you'll see this ruling listed here, Harmon-Martínez. This is a landmark case in our state, and Laurie will share a little bit more about it, but it really does influence everything we do now. Additionally, you'll see toward the bottom of the slide, all of this legislation that's been passed to account for young people of color in our state and to ensure that they're provided for in our educational systems. And what is unfortunate is that much of this legislation has been unfunded and it's not necessarily always a mandate. So they don't always find themselves in practice in our schools. And that's also important to understand. There's a lot of support for language and culture in our state. It's an important part of our state, but also making sure that it occurs and supporting young people in that way, it's more limited in schools. And Ronnie, I believe you're going to share a little bit about this slide.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lisa. I'm definitely not going to read this to you guys, but there's some things here that no matter how many times I see this data, it pops out to me. So New Mexico is the only minority majority state in the United States. I think that we're actually very, very, very proud of that. And it reflects in our cuisine and in our events and culture. 60% of adults are people of color, 74% of youth are people of color. The one on the bottom right is shocking to me no matter how many different times I look at it. The New Mexico metro area has the highest rate of youth disengagement from school and work in the United States. That's essentially 20% of our youth are not in school and not working. That's a rough statistic there. Lowest four-year graduation rate in the United States, but 80% of the Caucasian students are graduating. So one thing that I wanted to say about this is this may look like some hopeless data. We've had a long history of very traditional school, but that's not really made for our students, as you can see. And so the shift now toward graduate profiles and capstones and project-based learning is definitely going to have an impact on this. And this group specifically, we are making dramatic change already, just meeting for a year, basically. We're already making some dramatic change around the state. Thank you.
Thank you, Ronnie. And to underline what Ronnie shared, I'd like to share just briefly about how this initiative, this statewide capstone initiative started. This is in partnership with our State Department of Education to create capstones as a graduation pathway. At first, it started as an additional assessment in addition to the SAT, which is required by state law as a graduation requirement, some sort of external assessment or demonstration of competency. So we were adding capstones to that list, but the state has taken the initiative to further change graduation requirements. And now capstone is a really meaningful graduation pathway. And our hope is that some of that disengagement data that Ronnie spoke to and the dropout rate in New Mexico will shift because learning will become more authentic and meaningful for young people in the state. And so this is really the beginning of the work that was done to start this Capstone initiative in our state, was with young people and with educators and empathy interviews. And then that's an important part of the liberatory design process that we'll share a little bit more about. But it really informed all of the solutions and decision-making that came after, and presented capstones as an option, as a solution to some of the things you've seen on previous slides. So our model for the capstone, because there are myriad options all over the country, and we don't claim to have invented capstones, that's certainly not the case either. And in fact, I see someone in the group taught AP capstone. So that's another example of capstones. Ours, however, is tightly linked to a graduate profile and is grounded in the community in learning and assessment. And so the graduate profile will define some knowledge, skills, and attributes that young people should have. And by doing this with the community, with students, with educators, all stakeholders, then it reflects local values and culture and language. And we have some examples to share with you what that ultimately looks like. And then it becomes the district's North Star and informs then the capstone as part of school programming. And it's oriented to the community. They've named what those knowledge, skills, and attributes need to be in the graduate profile. And then that informs the learning and assessment that happens in the capstones. And this can also include key high school competencies. There are different models in the state. They vary pretty widely. But ultimately, it's that their young people are learning in the community and with the community. So here's an example of a graduate profile in our state. This is from central New Mexico, basically that metro area that you saw the statistic of the highest disengagement rate in the whole country. And that statistic amounts to about 44,000 young people in one part of our state that's disengaged from school and work. And so this graduate profile comes from that part of our state, our community. And so on the left, you can see all of the I statements that young people should know and can do by the time that they graduate from high school. And then also on the right, there's a launch pad of experiences that young people need in order to achieve these things, to support them as they continue their lives after high school. So this is one example. And this is another example. Laurie comes from the Zuni community. She's the capstone educator there. And so she'll share a little bit more about the context for her and her community. But this is their graduate profile. And also I want to give a shout out. Regina Vigil is on this call, and she really is the person who pushed the work forward and ensured that the community was engaged in the process. And so just want to give Regina you a shout out as well. And to call attention to this slide specifically is to say that there are all these important knowledge, skills, and attributes listed here. They're grounded in the context in that community. And all of the images in the graduate profile come from the community. And it has real meaning for the community and for the young people that will be learning these skills. And also on the right side, this is not the best picture of Lakin, but they will be, or in this picture, you can see that they're presenting their wellness wheel as part of their capstone assessment. And so this wellness wheel is an actualization of their graduate profile, because one of the attributes is to apply knowledge, skills, and attitudes to develop a healthy identity, to manage emotions, and achieve personal and collective goals. And this wellness wheel, the young people monitor their well-being at different parts of the school year. And so Lakin here is presenting their wellness wheel across the entire year in their capstone. And Laurie will share a little bit more about her experience specifically as a capstone educator in her community and what this means to young people. Thanks, Laurie.
Thank you, Lisa. So the title is Affirming Student Identity in Learning and Assessment. And this is Mariah Espino, who was one of my capstone students in the 2021 school year. And the little bio down there says Mariah Espino was a Zuni High School senior at the onset of the pandemic in 2020. And when COVID stress caused her mental health to suffer, she said her capstone project grounded me in my culture and especially my Zuni core values and filled her with confidence to keep going. However, she went on to be accepted into a very prestigious program, which combined her master's and doctorate in the state of New Mexico, that she would just have the scholarship that took her all the way through. And upon arriving at University of New Mexico, she found herself in the company of many, many, many students who were at the top of their classes, non-native students who frequently flaunted their accomplishments, their awards, their valedictorian status, all of those things. And even though she was quite an accomplished student herself, she began to feel quite diminished and uncertain about herself and developed what she calls imposter syndrome, or trying to be something that she thought she was not, and working to find ways to make herself as, you know, on their level. And then she said that she recalled the capstone presentation where she was using her Shiwi language and speaking in front of her family in a very prominent forum, and so proud that her family could hear her using her language in this final presentation and accomplishment of her senior year. And it was at that point that she said that I understood, you know, what it meant, you know, to truly come home, and that all I had to do was go back to that capstone moment to remind me of who I am and how grounded I am in my own cultural identity. And then capstones is a solution to the Harmon-Martínez laws. And so we have this quote from the New Mexico Center on Law and Poverty, that in violation of the state constitution, the state has failed to provide students with the programs and services that it acknowledges prepares them for college and career. And it goes on to say that extended learning, dual language, culturally and linguistically relevant education, social services, small class sizes, and sufficient funding for teacher recruitment, retention, and training is critical. And even more significant is the statement from Wilhelmina Yazzie, who was initial plaintiff in the Yazzie lawsuit. And she says, it's time for our leaders to be courageous and make real changes for our kids all across the country. People are standing up against the inequities caused by hundreds of years of systemic racism. It's time for our state to stop fighting the lawsuit and instead address the inequities in our schools. And what I want to add to this is, as an Indigenous person, an Indigenous woman, a survivor of the boarding schools, it's critical for America to know that the boarding school era had one single intent, and that was to strip the language and culture from our Indigenous young people so that they would no longer have ties to the land, because our stories, our language is written in the land, and it is significant to our sovereignty, which is inherent due to our occupation of this land from time immemorial. And so when we look at public education today and we think about, you know, what the transition was from the boarding school era to public education, very little changed. Language and culture was not allowed in the boarding school institutions, and neither is allowed in our public education today. And decolonization is everyone's obligation.
Thank you so much, Laurie, for providing some overview and context for Harmon-Martínez. That was a big focus for our COP group. And you're going to hear a lot more about some of the outcomes of our group. To start, the small groups that we formed for the COP really moved us into having some courageous conversations. And part of what we did in the group is we reflected on the curriculum, specifically Capstone curriculum, and how Capstone is really grounded in some essential learning and some essential outcomes. Part of that was really focused on identity and providing space for students to explore their identity, their unique identities, their lived experiences and their passions, and how these would help transform their capstone projects and create an authentic, safe learning environment for them. And then specific to, oh, sorry, that's okay. Oh, if you could go back to the other slide, thank you. Specific to the Harmon-Martínez lawsuit, one of the things that we found in our group that we didn't initially intend on discovering is that a big need to know for New Mexico educators is the Harmon-Martínez lawsuit and how to be culturally and linguistically responsive in teaching. And that needs to be really a foundation of what educators learn and experience before they start teaching capstone projects. I'm going to pass it to Julie, who's going to share a little bit more about the outcomes of our COP group.
Thank you. Yeah, so as a part, we were a group of educators who were kind of all over the spectrum on teaching capstone, some of us actively teaching it, some of us helping develop curriculum, some of us teaching teachers. I was teaching capstone at the time where we were doing this past spring. And so a part of this was just an opportunity to feel really validated in the types of curriculum that we were implementing with our students. Not everybody, some of you guys can probably relate to, not everybody knows what you're talking about when you're talking about capstone, and not all administrations fall in the same sort of buy-in. So just meeting with a group of people who were like-minded and passionate about this idea and really invested in the idea that capstone can be super transformative, not just for our individual students, but for our education system as a whole, was just really helped kind of work against that teacher burnout and help us cope with some of the craziness of teaching capstone, because teaching individualized curriculum is challenging. So that was a big piece of it for me, was just that space to be in. Also, it was just really nice to share curriculum ideas. We were like, I was all proud of this Google Doc I had made with hyperlinks to assignments and readings, and everyone was like, wow, this is great. And I was just like, wow, thank you. Because you don't always get that at your school. And then being able to see other people's resources like that and share readings that were helpful for our students to think about their identities. So just literally the act of being able to share those kinds of resources was very empowering, very fun. The brainstorm opportunity. We also did a couple of school visits, and we were able to involve students, which was really cool. So I was able to bring 3 students from the school I was at, from the South Valley in Albuquerque, to Zuni High School. Zuni High School students gave us a tour and showed us around. We saw language classes, we saw art classes. They showed us about their capstone projects. And anytime students get to share, it's powerful, especially across different communities. So that was a big piece of it, and educators participated in that as well. And then same thing from Zuni to South Valley Academy. That was a really cool experience. One of my capstone students, he was able to share his work around really investigating and interrogating machismo and homophobia within his own community. The classroom was full. I think he was like, oh my God, wowza, what did I volunteer for? But, to be able to really talk to other young people about that issue is a really pretty unique opportunity. So that became a part of his capstone experience, was sharing all that. And educators from Zuni as well, being able to just share knowledge about, well, what do we ask for kids to share in their exhibitions, and who are the audiences? And so all those pieces happening at the same time is just really fun. Yeah, again, that was all grounded in the identity work that we kind of came to notice that we all thought was really important moving forward, and which is embedded within the Harmon-Martínez case, going back to letting students do that self-discovery work, back to Laurie's story about her student, because we all know students that are stellar in our classrooms and they go to college and they're like, yikes. But we know that capstone has the power to keep them going through those difficult times. So what we really found was that these places, like sharing the curriculum, sharing our own teaching experiences, was really empowering. And we know that this is a part, now we know, I don't think that we did know this, but now we know that capstone can be a real solution to the issues brought up in the Harmon-Martínez case and the issues that people in New Mexico have been pushing for. Yeah, again, we didn't know that, but we've come to know that. And so that's kind of, through this presentation, we're also getting to reflect on that. So I'll pass it off to Kristen for this next piece.
One thing we found in the group is that it naturally happened for us to have these courageous conversations about how we were going to transform education within our own state and address the inequities brought up within the subgroups talked about within the Harmon-Martínez lawsuit. So we wanted to ask you all, and Lisa, if you could go to the next slide. We want to know from you all, what kind of inequities have you observed in your own schools or districts that remain unaddressed at the expense of students' education? And, you know, these things came out of our own experiences in Capstone projects. It came out in our conversations in our groups. And we feel like the Capstone project really addressed on a daily habit and a daily practice of addressing inequities in education within our state. So we wanted to pose the question to you all, what kind of inequities have you observed? And then what does it mean to be courageous in order to make changes for youth within your schools or districts? And if you all wouldn't mind just unmuting and sharing, or you can utilize the chat to share your thoughts. We can also allow for a couple minutes for you all to process and think about this before you share. Julie, do you want to share one of your examples while people are processing the questions? Or does anyone else in the group have one that they want to share?
I can kind of elaborate what I was thinking, like with our theme on identity. And I think sometimes, and especially in senior year, there's like this sense of hurry and urgency, like we've got to get so much crammed into these kids before they graduate, that how could we possibly take the time to pause and have them reflect on who they are and their culture and do that identity work and do some critical thinking work. But I think as Capstone teachers kind of pushing back and saying, no, like this work matters, like our students interviewing their family members about their own family histories and cultures, like taking the time to create that space for our students is just as important as them, you know, cramming through to make their plans for the future or setting those goals. I mean, those things will come, but like to Laurie's point, if they're not secure in themselves and their identities when they leave, then those goals won't come to fruition anyway. So I think just having the courage to kind of push back against some of the like Western ideas about what it means to be ready when you graduate and grounding ourselves in the identity work would be some of the courageous acts that I could kind of resonate with me.
Okay, I'll go. Excuse my voice, I am not feeling well, so I hope you can hear me. But one thing that I saw quite a bit when teaching the AP Capstone program, we have a very high, it's Houston, Texas. We have a very high Latino and Black population. And particularly looking at identity, students are coming up with their own idea with which to pursue and not having a space where they are really supported in having that concept of wonderment. It affects the speed with which and the breadth with which you think about your own identity, and definitely having concepts and ideas and units supporting students to try and look in these areas. It still doesn't really support self-investigation or looking at that true sense of what autonomy looks like. And so, for example, 2 years ago, one of my students was wanting to look at the commodification of Black culture through TikTok and how much research is really out there. And so you're needing to look at multiple different sources that might not necessarily look school appropriate. And now we have a paywall on these different sources. And so it's multiple different hurdles to try and get the support to even pursue an idea that doesn't necessarily look school appropriate, even when you do finally have that sense of autonomy.
Thank you for sharing, Allison. And I just want to underline something that you've shared is that the need for support in capstones. And just to share, one of our findings in our research phase for this initiative found that young people of color were more likely to choose topics for capstones that are informed by their own experiences, their lived experiences. And so what we found is that that is often comes from a place of trauma, systemic trauma or personal experience trauma. So it does require a different kind of support, not just the access to resources, but also how can educators support young people navigating these topics that are in an academic way and also in a very personal way. So thank you, Allison, for sharing that. I really do appreciate that.
Can I also share, I also had the same thought around that, Lisa. And that's why part of the learning and support provided is like social emotional, because students are processing their traumas through their project, which is really powerful. And I think that sometimes we forget about it because it's an academic space, but there's a lot of learning and healing that happens within the capstone project itself. We have someone that shared in the chat. Paul, thank you so much. We have two that shared in the chat. So if you could read those, I can also read them if that's appropriate. But please visit the chat to read other people's sharing on the discussion prompt. And we would love it if anyone else would feel comfortable unmuting and sharing their thoughts.
I teach at Storm Lake High School in Iowa, and we have quite a few, there's lots of different minority students. And I think one of the things that maybe as adults, what we forget is that we're getting kids from all over and we just still make a lot of assumptions. I think they come to our school, we don't know where they've come from 2 days before. So like sometimes that's kind of an interesting dynamic, and then they go into their algebra classes or whatever their classes are and try to learn. And like I keep thinking about how ways to help kids as they come into our school and try to adjust and all the cultural things and their backgrounds. And when you just mentioned their traumas and those kinds of things, like it's really obviously humans are complex.
Thank you so much for sharing. And I feel like we're going to touch on some of those thoughts, Sandy, as we move forward in our presentation. So if you haven't gotten a chance to share, you're still processing, please feel free to share your thoughts in the chat, and we'll keep moving forward with our presentation.
Thank you,
Lisa,
Kristen.
do you want to... Oh, thank you.
Yes, thank you. And what you all have shared are really important ideas and in our community as well. So there's so many shared experiences and also things that are specific to our state. So I really appreciate you all sharing, especially your own personal experiences in this way and being vulnerable. So thank you. And also, I just wanted to think about the work that this group does to decolonize ourselves and assessment in the state. We moved from a really test-heavy top-down model and are working really hard to re-engage educators in a different way. Kristen has a great blog about avoiding teacher burnout when you're a capstone teacher, because it's just like a really enriching, beautiful experience. And so that's part of it. And also just recognizing that through this assessment and learning experience, we can engage young people in a very different way to come to know who they really are, as I believe Sandy was sharing too, instead of making assumptions, really digging deep and learning who they are in those projects and in that learning environment. And also that learning comes from the community too, that young people are learning in and with the community as well. And as Paul suggested too, lack of supports for learning outside of the community, that is important. And so, or excuse me, outside of the classroom, that is an important consideration, and certainly opening up schools to community in reciprocity with schools operating in reciprocity with the community is an important principle here. And so all of these things that we've engaged in listed here on this slide really pointed to liberatory design as an opportunity. And in fact, I would just like to give Paul credit because he is actually the person who introduced liberatory design to me as we were planning together a community of practice for school and district leaders last year. We have a vertical strategy. We engage teachers and students and school and district leaders. And so just we'll say a little bit about liberatory design as a whole. Kristen's going to share the Equity Project website. This is not ours. This came from the Stanford School of Design. It kind of evolved from that. But what you can see is that it provides structure to to design work, and also attends to the oppressive systems in which we live and work. And so in the middle of this flower, and as part of the design cycle, is noticing and reflecting. So we're going to talk mostly about that. Noticing, being aware of the systems in which we live, reflecting on our own place in those systems, and also the work that we need to do to decolonize ourselves and become liberators ourselves. And so, for example, me as a white woman, I found this process to be very enriching and helpful in guiding the conversations that happened in the group, and also gave space for really rich conversations. And so this first step of notice and reflect helps set the context for the entire year, essentially. And so part of this process is to identify some mindsets that are important to you based on what they have put together, the National Equity Project. They come from the National Equity Project. There's a deck, in fact, that we used that they provide. And so they're listed here, and you can see all these sticky notes, so to speak, laid on top of some of these mindsets. This was the first step in identifying which mindsets we would attend to as a group. We selected 3. And ultimately, the one that we chose that was most important to us as a group was attending to healing, which I've circled in red. And you can see in this first step that actually only 3 of us in the group selected as a mindset, but through conversation and consensus, we recognized it's important to the group and the work that we were trying to do to change assessment in the state. And because this kind of assessment, capstone assessment, is healing in New Mexico. As I said, we came from a really test-heavy, top-down. Even we got to the point where our evaluations, very close to the point where our evaluations were tied our evaluations were tied to test scores, but our pay, we came very close to our pay being tied to test scores as well. So very punitive, deficit views of what young people can do and what teachers can do. And then coming into capstones as a learning and assessment option and building a community together of like-minded people, we found that it really did need to be a space of healing. And so that was a really important part of our process, was coming to that. And, you know, we can't leave anything like well enough alone. We got to just like make it New Mexican, because that's the way you do it in New Mexico. And so what we did, this is the slide actually for attending to healing. And in our conversation, we realized that this is an important practice, attending to healing, and we needed something more than that. And so I'm going to turn it over to Minea, who will speak a little bit more about Apapacho, which we renamed attending to healing, and really considering the connotation of that word, its history, its meaning. And so thank you, Minea, for sharing that with us.
Thank you, Lisa. So thank you everyone for having us here. It's very generous on your part to provide this space. So I'm just going to talk briefly about some of the conversations that we had around Apapacho as a mindset, and as part of this element that we unpacked throughout several months of work in every session, and that really derived from this liberatory design framework that Lisa brought to us in the first sessions. So as it was mentioned, we're all looking at the context of Harmon-Martínez that has become a decolonized antenna in what's developing in New Mexico. So from a legal framework, now this is becoming a reality within our learning communities, and it lends itself and it calls for a decolonization that first has to start from within. So this context of transformative pedagogies that we've been talking about was really looking for ways to find a lens that would identify the needs of educators in the groups that were part of this collaborative endeavor in the educators co-op. I just want to mention that this process of healing was a challenge, as it's often being constructed and redirected to a Western notion of healing. So being that we are situated in what is known as Camino Real de Tierra Adentro, which is that stretch of land that unites Santa Fe to Nahuatl lands, we found this concept of Apapacho to be pertinent to some of the needs that we were thinking about when we thought about healing. Like, what does healing mean? It resonated with me definitely as a Mexican American Hispana that has been living in New Mexico for the last decade, but it really brought together some of the necessities of this conversation around healing. So Apapacho as a mindset, as it was presented, whether we think about it as a category of analysis or a category on its own, it really responds to the specific healing we identified as a group. And it took us back to those local values that were addressing language and culture. We recognize that in thinking about healing, we needed something that would reflect these local values that were different from any other context. So another angle was that this reevaluation post-COVID brought needs that were amplified and challenged in all the communities of color throughout the state that were in this conversation about assessment, about teaching, and about pedagogical practices. So Apapacho, in this sense, it provided in its interaction with assessment an opportunity to remediate how much we have failed our students historically. And now in thinking of providing opportunities to demonstrate their learning and their interaction with school, we were hoping to find ways for us as educators and to take back to our learning communities a new opportunity to just rebuild those ties with the schools. And finally, this is the definition of Apapacho. In Nahuatl, it translates into an affectionate hug or a pat. So we thought about just how we all needed like this affectionate part of teaching and practice in assessment and overall in our communities. So thank you.
Thank you, Minea, for sharing that. And I think Julie and Kristen, you'll share a little bit more about the group, and then Laurie will help us wrap up with some personal experiences related to the group. So thank you.
Yes, thank you, Minea, for providing context for that. And part of what happened once we had set the mindset within the group is that we found that the resource became the group. And that was kind of the power behind using the liberatory mindset in this design process, because it transformed what we were working on within the group. And I think many of us came into the group thinking, oh, we have to produce all these resources. And we were like productive oriented instead of thinking about what we really needed as capstone teachers. And it kind of transformed our work in the group to be more of a supportive space where we began sharing resources, but it wasn't just about sharing resources. It was us feeling like this group was a place of support. And really that's what came out of the group, is that it was the resource. And I want to pass it over to Julie to share a little bit more about that experience.
And to go back to something Kristen said earlier, as capstone teachers, we often end up really doing a lot of emotional support for our students. And I think that we need that too. And so we maybe found that in each other. So creating this space of Apapacho with our students and then with each other, I think was really powerful. And this is all in the context of this statewide work. So now we have more educators coming into the realm of capstone. And so I think we've also realized, okay, well, how can this group support with keeping the ideas of capstone and what the transformative work that capstone can do? How do we make sure we stay grounded in the decolonization work and the anti-racism work and centering students' identity and student sovereignty and moving forward with their lives and the work that they want to do in their capstone so they're prepared when they graduate? Almost as like this group can be kind of a reminder that, okay, we know that we can serve our students better. We have an obligation to serve our diverse and underserved students better. And we know that capstone can do this work, but we need to maintain our grounded in this framework that we've found here in this group, because there will be pushback and there will be struggles and there will be challenges. So the resource is the group. And I'll pass it off to Laurie.
Thank you, Julie. So yes, what we've learned and what we can expect is that courageous conversations are guaranteed to be messy. And capstone development is a painful process, as in giving birth. And many of we capstone educators do not occupy the same positions as previously. During this process, we must be prepared for extremely uncomfortable moments in order for this process to grow and take root. For example, my Zuni High School capstone students identified their problem of practice as this statement that CPSD teachers still do not recognize that New Mexico is the law. To begin this process, they concept map a number of problems that they've identified, and some of those problems were, a concern that Zuni High School students weren't being taught, the difference between reservation boundaries and ancestral territory, or there wasn't a focus on sacred sites that were at risk due to fuel and mineral extraction. And as we continue to narrow it down, they came upon, the reality that Harmon-Martínez is not recognized as the law. And so this is the problem that they presented. This is where they started their presentation. And was my heart beating fast when they addressed that? Yes, because I knew that we were, cutting to the quick. This was kind of no man's land, and that certainly we were going to step on toes. We were exceeding boundaries, and yet there was a certain thrill about it. And when the students had finished their presentation, the school board president and vice president stood up and applauded them and celebrated them and said they'd never heard anything like this. The community was significantly impacted. Parents were weeping. they were so astounded at the eloquence of their own children, not realizing the extent of the work that they had been invested in for all these weeks, that they'd been coming home late, that they'd missed practices, that they seemed to kind of disappear, off the face of the earth at a certain time. And they were just completely overcome with pride. And so while the community and the school board applauded this work and work focus, there was significant pushback from those who have not embraced or perhaps refused to embrace the idea that we are all responsible for the work of decolonization. However, we know that the seeds have taken root and we see them blossoming. This Wednesday's session, early morning session for Aurora, is going to feature one of my capstone students that you saw in the slide that Lisa talked about in conjunction with the graduate profile, which is like an epilus. And he is a profoundly eloquent young man. And I look forward to hearing, what he has to say. He has especially spoken personally about how much the capstone project meant to him, not being confined to the four walls of a classroom and, with nose to the book and pencil in hand, but going out and exploring, including the community, seeking out the community's input and their own thoughts, and then putting it together in the work of the capstone projects that they developed. So even though we may no longer remain in the role of capstone educators per se, we will always retain the capstone framework vision. And we will always work to advance capstone ideals in the context of equity and decolonization. And I would echo what some of my colleagues have said as far as the support this community of practice has provided for us. I know for myself, like at this time in leaving Zuni High School and then going on to find a position that would continue to help me advance that capstone mindset forward. It was a very lonely time. It was a very disheartening time. It was a great shock to the system, but I will say that this community of practice continued to encourage, support, validate, and celebrate, who we are as a group and the work that each one of us have done. And so I thank each one of them for their support. And I look forward to us all continuing to engage in these courageous conversations. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurie. I really appreciate you sharing your experiences and the experiences of your students too. Thank you. And Julie made the observation when we were meeting this morning too, that it's like Apapacho for ourselves as educators, but also that's what capstones are for students. And I thought that was like a really, really beautiful and profound idea. So lots of really good learning comes out of this group for each of us. And also one point of context that we did not provide is that this is a paid group. They're paid a stipend to come to meetings. But I have a feeling now if they weren't paid, they would still keep coming. But it's important to pay people for their time and energy. And so that's another way of pushing back against the system that often martyrs educators for the sake of their students. And so that's just something to name. And we have about 6 minutes left. So I just wanted to pause and see if you all have any questions or comments. But we really do appreciate you coming today, and feel free also to drop them in the chat and we can give voice to them. So thank you all.
I do have a question for all of you. These are in-person courses. Is that correct? Has anyone attempted capstone with an online or virtual setting?
So
Oh, sorry.
no,
I don't know who's going to talk. I don't want to talk over anyone.
I can actually, I think one of the most powerful capstone, I mean, they've continued to be very powerful, but during the pandemic, if that's what you're talking about, I just thought, I don't know how this is going to happen. And it was definitely an effort, but what the students came up with was incredibly significant and useful for the community, and it was really a testimony to every one of us how powerful collaboration can be, even when we're not faced
And thank you, Laurie. And just for context too, in the state, there aren't too many examples of capstones in the state, but we've been building them very quickly. So one school we're working with this year in learning with the community is online. It's kind of a hybrid campus, and it's up in Santa Fe. And so some of their students will be engaged in the work online and also in the community, and some will be on campus as well. So that's one example that we hope to learn from. Another school that we're working with is includes incarcerated students. And so some of those students are doing their curriculum online, but they'll also be engaged in a capstone with a community partner, even behind the walls. So that's a great question. Thank you.
Lisa, if I could just take a moment just to to echo the importance of the capstones. As a former colleague of Ms. Smith, it was my pleasure, my privilege to witness the capstone presentations, I believe 3 or 4 years in a row, and to watch the Zuni students in full regalia coming forward so eloquently. Their presentation was like a well choreographed, movement, coming forth with very important topics that, yeah, were controversial, but they came forward presenting positive solutions, well-researched solutions, not in any kind of, confrontational way, but coming forward as students who have been impacted by these and saying, hey, you need to do better by us, and here's some solutions that we can offer you. This is what we wish you could look at and incorporate into your future teaching, so that the students that come, our little brothers and sisters who come, come behind us can have the best of that instruction. So very, very powerful indeed. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Regina. I believe that might be it for today. If y'all have questions before we leave, we can put our emails in the chat if you'd like to direct questions to any one of us. And then from the team, I don't know if y'all have any concluding thoughts you'd like to offer before we leave the session.
I've also placed the survey session survey in the chat. If you all wouldn't mind taking a moment to just give us some feedback. We're also dropping our emails in the chat as a resource for you all.